Picture a world where one wrong move could seal your fate, where justice wasn't just served but carved into flesh, etched in stone, or written in blood. Long before courts and juries, before the idea of human rights even existed, ancient civilizations ruled with an iron fist, and their punishments were as creative as they were cruel. Today, we're stepping back into the shadows of history to uncover 25 of the most brutal punishments ever devised. These weren't just penalties, they were spectacles designed to terrify, to humiliate, and to remind everyone what happened to those who dared to break the rules. From the towering ziggurats of Babylon to the marble halls of Rome, every society had its own way of dealing with crime. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest known legal systems, demanded an eye for an eye, literally. In ancient Athens, you could be sentenced to drink poison for corrupting the youth. And in Rome, crucifixion wasn't just execution. It was a public display of power, a warning to anyone who might challenge the empire's authority. But why were these punishments so extreme? What drove ancient rulers to invent such horrifying methods of control? The answer lies in the fragile balance of order and fear, a balance that kept civilizations from crumbling into chaos. As we journey through these 25 punishments, you'll witness the ingenuity and the brutality of ancient justice. Some will shock you, others might make you question how far we've truly come. Because while we've traded floggings for fines and executions for life sentences, the echoes of these ancient systems still linger in the way we think about crime and punishment today. So brace yourself. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a haunting reminder of the darkness that once ruled the world, and a chance to reflect on the privileges we often take for granted in our modern legal systems. Ready to uncover the secrets of justice before human rights? Let's begin. The Brazen Bull stands as one of history's most chilling examples of punishment as performance. Designed in ancient Greece by a sculptor named Perilaus, this hollow bronze statue wasn't just a tool for execution, it was engineered to transform agony into theater. Victims would be sealed inside the bull's belly while flames licked at the metal, slowly roasting them alive, but the true horror lay in the details. As the metal heated, the victims' screams would travel through a series of pipes, distorting their cries into what sounded like the bellowing of a bull. It was a grotesque illusion, turning human suffering into spectacle for the crowd. What's even more unsettling, the Brazen Bull wasn't just about pain, it was about power. Rulers like Phalaris of Sicily used it to send a clear message. Defiance would be met with unimaginable torment, and the entire city would bear witness. The bull's design wasn't an accident. By merging cruelty with artistry, it elevated punishment into something almost ceremonial. This wasn't just justice, it was psychological control, reinforcing the idea that authority could shape reality itself, even turning screams into animal roars. Yet the Brazen Bull's legacy carries a dark irony. According to legend, Perilaus, its creator, became its first victim when Phalaris tested the device on him. A twisted twist of fate, proving that in these ancient systems no one was truly safe. As we explore other punishments, you'll notice this pattern again and again. The line between justice and brutality was often blurred, and the tools of punishment were as much about instilling fear as they were about retribution. The Brazen Bull wasn't just a method of execution, it was a symbol of how far societies would go to maintain order, and a haunting reminder of the creativity humans have wielded in the name of control. If the Brazen Bull turned suffering into theater, flaying transformed the human body into a living canvas of terror. The Assyrians, masters of psychological warfare, didn't just execute their enemies, they stripped them of their very humanity. Flaying, the meticulous removal of skin, was reserved for those who dared challenge the state's authority. Imagine the spectacle, a traitor's skin peeled away layer by layer, not just to inflict unbearable pain, but to erase their identity entirely. The message was unmistakable: defiance wouldn't just cost you your life, but your dignity in the afterlife. Across the ocean, the Aztecs wielded flaying with ritual precision. For them, skin wasn't just a symbol of shame, it was a sacred offering. Priests would wear the flayed skins of sacrificial victims, embodying the gods themselves. This wasn't mere punishment, it was a cosmic transaction where human suffering bridged the earthly and divine. Public displays of these ghastly remnants served as constant reminders. The state's power was absolute, woven into the fabric of religion and daily life. What's chilling is how flaying targeted more than the body. By mutilating the outer self, it attacked the very concept of personhood. In societies where the afterlife depended on physical wholeness, flaying was a spiritual death sentence. Assyrian reliefs show flayed bodies hung on city walls not just as warnings, but as perverse art. The Aztecs stretched skins over temple drums, turning human remains into instruments of ceremony. These acts reveal a dark truth. Ancient justice wasn't just about retribution. It was about reshaping reality, using the body as a tool to rewrite the rules of power and fear. Yet flaying's legacy endures in unexpected ways. Modern phrases like "skin in the game" or "saving your own skin" hint at how deeply these ancient horrors shaped our language. The next punishment takes this brutality even further, targeting not just the body but the very essence of human connection. Crucifixion wasn't just a method of execution, it was Rome's ultimate weapon of psychological warfare. Imagine the scene: a row of crosses lining a busy road, each one bearing a broken body left to writhe for days under the scorching sun. The Romans didn't invent crucifixion, but they refined it into an art of humiliation. Reserved for slaves, rebels, and those who threatened the social order, this punishment was meticulously designed to strip away dignity long before it claimed life. Victims weren't just killed, they were put on display, their suffering a grim advertisement of the empire's ruthlessness. The agony was calculated. Nails driven through wrists and feet caused excruciating pain, but the real torment came from the slow collapse of the body. With every labored breath, the victim's own weight would suffocate them, their chest muscles exhausting themselves in a futile struggle for air. Death could take hours or stretch into days, prolonged by the occasional sip of vinegar offered not out of mercy, but to extend the spectacle. And all of it unfolded in public, where passerby could gawk, jeer, or shudder in silent terror. What made crucifixion so effective wasn't just the physical brutality, but the message it sent. By placing crosses along well-traveled routes, Rome turned suffering into a civic lesson. Each gasping breath reinforced the same truth: defiance had a price, and the empire would make sure everyone saw it paid. Even the location mattered. Crucifixions often occurred outside city gates, a symbolic expulsion from society that mirrored the victim's spiritual and social death. This was justice as theater, where the audience was just as important as the condemned. Yet crucifixion's legacy is laced with irony. Though intended to erase rebels from memory, it immortalized them instead. The most famous victim, of course, was Jesus of Nazareth, a man whose crucifixion would eventually undermine the very empire that sought to silence him. Rome's tool of terror became a symbol of resistance, proving that even the most brutal punishments can't always control the stories we tell. As we move from Rome's crosses to ancient China, the next punishment reveals an even darker truth. some systems refused to let death be the end of justice. Because in certain corners of history, the dead could still be tried, condemned, and punished, proving that for those in power, vengeance knew no limits, not even the grave. Ling Chi, the very name sends a shiver down the spine. Known in the West as death by 1,000 cuts, this punishment from Imperial China was a masterpiece of suffering, designed not just to kill but to dismantle a person piece by piece. Reserved for the most egregious crimes, treason, patricide, or acts that shook the very foundations of Confucian order, Ling Chi was as much about ritual as it was about retribution. The condemned would be tied to a wooden frame in a public square, their body exposed to both the executioner's blade and the jeering crowd. But unlike swift beheadings or hangings, Ling Chi stretched agony into hours, sometimes days, with each incision carefully calculated to prolong life just long enough to maximize the torment. What made Ling Chi uniquely horrifying wasn't just the physical pain, but the psychological unraveling. The cuts followed a grim sequence, starting with non-lethal areas like the limbs, slowly working inward, ensuring the victim remained conscious through the entire ordeal. Some accounts describe executioners drugging the condemned to keep them from passing out too soon, a macabre act of mercy that only deepened the cruelty. And in a final act of humiliation, the dismembered remains were often scattered or displayed, a visceral warning to anyone who might dare challenge the emperor's authority. Yet Ling Chi wasn't just about punishment, it was a twisted form of moral theater. In a society that revered harmony and filial piety, crimes like patricide weren't just illegal, they were cosmic disruptions. By dismantling the body so meticulously, the state symbolically repaired the moral order, stitching society back together with the threads of suffering. Even the phrase 1,000 cuts carried weight not because the number was literal, but because it represented the totality of retribution, a debt painstakingly paid in flesh. The practice persisted into the early 20th century, with photographs of executions shocking Western observers and fueling debates about barbarism versus civilization. But Ling Chi's legacy lingers in darker corners of history. It reminds us how justice, when untethered from humanity, can become a performance of power where the body isn't just punished, but transformed into a message. And as we'll see next, that message wasn't unique to China. From the chopping blocks of medieval Europe to the mutilation codes of ancient Mesopotamia, societies worldwide understood one grim truth. Sometimes the most effective deterrent wasn't death, but the spectacle of its delivery. Scaphism stands as one of history's most grotesque examples of nature weaponized against the condemned. Originating in ancient Persia, this punishment transformed the elements themselves into instruments of agony. Picture a victim stripped naked, sandwiched between two hollowed-out boats or tree trunks, their head, hands, and feet protruding from gaps. Then came the ritualistic force feeding, a nauseating diet of milk and honey, repeated until the prisoner's body became a breeding ground for infection. But the real horror began when the assembly was set adrift on stagnant water or left under the blazing sun, turning the body's own waste into a lure for insects, maggots, and scavengers. The cruelty of Scaphism lay in its unhurried precision. Unlike swift executions, this was a slow unraveling, a collaboration between human design and natural decay. Flies swarmed to lay eggs in the victim's flesh, rats gnawed at exposed limbs, toxins from infection seeped into the bloodstream. Some accounts suggest the process could stretch for weeks, the victim drifting in and out of consciousness as their body was consumed alive. And all the while, the honey-smeared openings of the boats ensured the torment was visible, even audible. To onlookers, this wasn't just death, It was a grotesque exhibition of suffering where the environment became both executioner and audience. What's most chilling is how Scaphism absolved its perpetrators of direct blame. By outsourcing the violence to insects and decay, Persian authorities could claim a veneer of detachment, as if nature itself had passed judgment. Yet the punishment's symbolism was deliberate. Milk and honey, symbols of abundance, were perverted into tools of torture, a mockery of life's nourishment. The boats, vessels meant for safe passage, became coffins of prolonged agony. Even the victims' screams were muffled by the wooden shells, their suffering reduced to faint, desperate echoes. Scaphism's legacy forces us to confront a disturbing truth. Some punishments weren't just about ending life, but about dismantling humanity itself. As we shift focus to psychological torments, remember this: the ancient world understood that true control wasn't just over bodies, but over minds. And few methods proved this more brutally than the living tombs of Rome's Vestal Virgins, where betrayal was met not with fire or blade, but with isolation so profound it fractured the soul. The breaking wheel was medieval Europe's answer to justice as theater, a punishment so gruesome it blurred the line between execution and performance. Picture a wooden wheel taller than a man mounted in a public square. The condemned would be stretched across its spokes, their limbs splayed like a macabre starfish. Then, with deliberate precision, the executioner would raise an iron-tipped hammer and begin the slow work of shattering bones. Arms, legs, ribs, each strike was calculated to inflict maximum pain without delivering a fatal blow. Some victims lasted for days, their broken bodies left to twist in the wind as crows circled overhead. Others were granted a grim mercy with a final crushing blow to the chest, but only after the crowd had soaked in every excruciating detail. What made the wheel so terrifying wasn't just the brutality, it was the spectacle. Townspeople would gather to watch, their children perhaps clutching their sleeves as the condemned screams echoed off the cobblestones. The wheel wasn't hidden in some dungeon. It stood in the open, a permanent fixture in the landscape of fear. After death, the shattered corpse often remained lashed to the wheel, left to rot in plain sight as a warning to anyone tempted by theft, rebellion, or heresy. In some cases, the wheels were mounted on poles along roadsides, turning the remains into ghoulish mile markers that whispered, "This could be you." The psychology behind the wheel was fiendishly effective. By prolonging suffering, authorities didn't just punish the criminal, they traumatized the witnesses. Every shattered bone reinforced the idea that the law wasn't just about justice, but about dominance. Even the wheel's design played a role. Its circular shape mirrored the wheels of carts and industry, a perverse reminder that crime disrupted the machinery of society. And in an era where pain was often seen as divine retribution, the wheel's agony carried a spiritual weight. Suffering wasn't just physical, it was a prelude to eternal judgment. Yet the wheel's legacy holds a dark irony. While it was meant to deter crime, records suggest public executions often devolved into rowdy festivals, with vendors selling food and spectators treating the event as morbid entertainment. The very spectacle designed to reinforce authority sometimes undermined it, revealing a tension between fear and fascination that still echoes in modern true crime obsessions. From the wheel's orchestrated brutality, we turn to a punishment that traded hammers for water, where drowning wasn't just an execution, but a sacred act. In the bogs and rivers of ancient Europe, some cultures believed the line between justice and sacrifice was as fluid as the currents themselves. The bogs of ancient Europe held more than water. They cradled secrets of a justice system where the line between execution and offering blurred into darkness. For the Celts, these murky wetlands weren't just graves, they were sacred courtrooms. criminals, traitors, or those accused of unspeakable taboos would be dragged to the water's edge, their hands bound with woven ropes, their feet weighted with stones. Then, with ritual solemnity, they'd be pushed into the peat-rich depths, the bog swallowing them whole. But unlike swift drownings in rivers or lakes, the bog's embrace was slow, its thick waters resisting struggle, ensuring the condemned had agonizing moments to contemplate their fate before suffocation claimed them. What makes these bog bodies so haunting isn't just their preservation, leathery skin, hair still intact but the clues etched into their remains. Some show signs of repeated violence before death, broken ribs, crushed skulls, even nooses left around necks. Others seem eerily peaceful, their faces frozen in expressions that could be sleep or surrender. This variation suggests a chilling truth: each drowning was tailored to the crime. A thief might receive a quicker end, while a murderer or oath-breaker could endure torture before the final plunge. The bogs weren't just execution sites, they were archives of anguish, their acidic waters preserving not just bodies but stories. The spiritual weight of these drownings can't be overstated. To the Celts, bogs were liminal spaces, doorways between worlds. By sinking a criminal into them, authorities didn't just erase a life, they exiled a soul, denying it passage to the afterlife. Some victims were pinned down with wooden stakes, a physical manifestation of this eternal imprisonment. Others were placed in careful poses, their limbs arranged as if in prayer or submission, suggesting ceremonies where the community participated in the condemnation. This wasn't just punishment, it was exorcism, a purging of corruption from both society and the cosmos. Modern discoveries like Toland Man and Lindo Man offer silent testimony to this practice. Toland's face, so serene it could be sleeping, still wears the noose that killed him. Lindo's stomach contains traces of a final meal, charred bread, perhaps a sacrificial gesture. These details transform abstract history into visceral reality, reminding us that behind every ritual was a living, breathing person. The bogs didn't just preserve bodies, they preserved moments, freezing in time the instant where justice, religion, and mortality collided. As we move from water to fire, the next punishment reveals how some cultures turned the elements against the condemned in even more theatrical ways. Because while the bogs hid their horrors beneath the surface, other methods ensured suffering was impossible to ignore, burning brightly for all to see. Impalement wasn't just execution, it was a slow-motion horror show designed to paralyze entire populations with fear. The technique was simple in its brutality. A sharpened pole, often greased to ease penetration, would be driven upward through the body, sometimes entering through the rectum and exiting near the shoulder. But what made impalement uniquely terrifying was the care taken to avoid vital organs, allowing victims to writhe for hours or even days beneath the sun. The poles would be erected in rows along roads or city gates, transforming landscapes into forests of suffering where the dying served as silent warnings to the living. No one weaponized this method more ruthlessly than Vlad III of Wallachia, the ruler who would inspire Bram Stoker's Dracula. Historical accounts describe his banquet hall surrounded by impaled victims, a grisly decor meant to unsettle diplomats during negotiations. When Ottoman envoys refused to remove their turbans as a sign of respect, Vlad reportedly had the headpieces nailed to their skulls. His most infamous display came in 1462, when he impaled 20,000 Ottoman soldiers outside the city of Targovist, arranging the stakes in geometric patterns so intricate that the advancing Sultan Mehmed II allegedly turned back, overwhelmed by the stench and spectacle. The psychological calculus behind impalement was chillingly precise. Unlike hidden executions, these public displays were impossible to ignore. The writhing victims, the vultures circling overhead, the groans carried by the wind, every detail reinforced the ruler's absolute power. In an era before mass media, impalement was viral propaganda, a message that spread through horrified whispers across kingdoms. Even the positioning of stakes held meaning. Common criminals might be impaled horizontally, while nobles faced vertical poles, their elevated suffering mirroring their fallen status. What's often overlooked is how impalement weaponized shame as much as pain. In many cultures, the anus symbolized vulnerability and dishonor. By violating this intimate space, executioners didn't just kill, they stripped victims of dignity in life and afterlife. Some victims reportedly begged for beheading instead, preferring quick death to prolonged degradation. This intersection of physical and psychological torment made impalement the ultimate tool for rulers like Vlad, whose grip on power depended on keeping subjects trapped between terror and obedience. From these gruesome stakes, we turn to a punishment that traded physical agony for social annihilation, where the goal wasn't just to harm the body, but to erase a person's very place in the world. Because sometimes the most effective chains weren't made of iron, but of whispers and turned backs. Branding wasn't just punishment, it was a living ledger of guilt, etched into skin where the world couldn't look away. In ancient Rome, a runaway slave might wake to the sear of a hot iron pressing "fug" for fugitives into their forehead, a permanent announcement of their attempted freedom. Thieves in medieval England bore a T on their right hand, while blasphemers in Puritan colonies had their tongues pinned with red-hot skewers before receiving a B branded onto their cheeks. These marks did more than hurt, they transformed flesh into a public record, ensuring every handshake, every glance in the mirror carried the weight of judgment. The cruelty of branding lay in its permanence. Unlike scars from floggings or healed fractures, these symbols were meticulously designed to resist fading. Some cultures mixed ink or ash into the wounds to darken the marks, while others reapplied heat over the years to refresh the stigma. In Assyria, adulterers were branded with images of their alleged crimes, a grotesque mural of shame that turned the body into a walking courtroom. These weren't just punishments, they were social death sentences, cutting off opportunities for marriage, employment, or even shelter. A branded person became a cautionary tale, their very skin a warning to others. But branding's psychological impact ran even deeper. In societies where identity was tied to community standing, these marks didn't just isolate, they rewrote a person's story. A single symbol could override a lifetime of integrity, reducing complex lives to a single, damning letter. The practice persisted into the modern era, with European convicts transported to Australia in the 18th century still bearing marks like D for deserter or BC for bad character. Even after serving their sentences, the brands clung to them, a shadow that no amount of time could shake. Yet the most chilling aspect of branding wasn't the iron or the pain, it was the way it outsourced punishment to society itself. Once marked, the condemned faced a lifetime of unofficial penalties, turned away glances, barred doors, whispered slurs. The state didn't need to imprison them, their neighbors would enforce the sentence daily. This collective complicity reveals a dark truth about ancient justice. Its power came not just from rulers, but from the willingness of ordinary people to participate in the machinery of shame. Now imagine a punishment where the state didn't just mark the guilty, it forced their own blood to wield the knife. Because in some cultures, justice wasn't just about suffering, but about twisting love into betrayal, making family the hand of execution itself. Few punishments reveal the cold calculus of ancient justice more starkly than those that turned homes into execution chambers. In certain societies from imperial China to the Mongol steppes, families found themselves handed an unimaginable choice: spill the blood of their own kin or face annihilation alongside them. This wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about weaponizing love itself. When a rebellion was crushed in Tang Dynasty China, entire clans received orders to strangle their accused relatives with silk cords, a grim nod to Confucian ideals where family honor demanded compliance with the state. The cords would later be displayed as proof of loyalty, transforming intimate acts of violence into bureaucratic receipts. The psychological brutality of these practices lay in their inversion of nature. Parents who raised children with tenderness were suddenly expected to become their executioners. Siblings who shared childhood memories now shared the weight of a blade. In some Mongol tribes, a family member who refused to participate in the killing would be lashed to the corpse of their relative, left to rot together as a warning about the cost of mercy. These weren't random acts of cruelty, they were meticulously designed social experiments. By forcing families to internalize the state's violence, rulers erased the line between personal morality and civic duty. Your home wasn't a refuge anymore, it was an extension of the executioner's block. What's perhaps most disturbing is how these systems exploited cultural values. In societies that revered filial piety like China, the act of killing a relative wasn't just physical violence, it was spiritual mutilation. Survivors bore twin burdens, the trauma of the deed and the shame of violating ancestral bonds. Meanwhile, nomadic cultures like the Mongols used collective punishment to bind tribes together through shared guilt, ensuring no single family would risk rebellion if it meant condemning their neighbors. The message was clear: justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty, but about rewriting the very fabric of human connection. Archaeological evidence reveals how deeply these practices cut. Excavated family compounds from the Yuan dynasty show hastily dug graves where victims were buried with tokens of affection, a child's toy, a mother's hairpin suggesting some relatives tried to soften the horror with small acts of love. Other sites reveal bodies with multiple wounds, hinting at reluctant executioners who hesitated mid-strike. These silent testaments remind us that behind every state-mandated killing was a network of shattered hearts, where the true punishment wasn't death, but the lifelong scars left on those forced to administer it. As we move from familial executions to punishments targeting the mind, consider this. If ancient systems could turn love into a weapon, what horrors awaited those who dared to think freely? The answer lies in the dark art of psychological torment, where isolation and sensory deprivation proved just as lethal as any blade. Blinding was more than an act of cruelty, it was a surgical strike against power itself. In the Byzantine Empire, where rulers were expected to embody divine majesty, the eyes weren't just organs, they were symbols of authority. A blind man couldn't lead armies, couldn't read sacred texts, couldn't even meet the gaze of his subjects. So when Emperor Basil II defeated the Bulgar rebellion in 1014, he didn't execute the 15,000 captives. Instead, he ordered 99 out of every 100 men blinded, leaving one eye intact in each 100th soldier to guide the others home. The message was unmistakable. Defiance wouldn't just cost you your freedom, but your very ability to perceive the world. The methods of blinding reveal a chilling precision. Some victims endured red-hot irons pressed to their corneas, the sizzle of searing flesh marking their descent into darkness. Others faced the slow trauma of gouging, where curved hooks pried eyeballs from their sockets while the victim was restrained. But the most politically calculated technique involved boiling vinegar poured into the eyes, a method that destroyed vision while leaving the outer appearance relatively intact. This wasn't just about inflicting pain, it was about crafting a living monument to imperial ruthlessness. A blinded noble might still attend court, his empty sockets serving as a constant reminder of the price of ambition. What made this punishment uniquely insidious was its cultural weight. In a society that believed rulers derived power from divine favor, blindness wasn't just a physical handicap, it was spiritual disqualification. The Byzantines inherited this belief from ancient traditions where mutilation barred access to sacred spaces. Hebrew law forbade priests with eye defects from making offerings, while Roman law claimed the founder of the Vestal Virgins blinded himself to atone for a mistake. By adopting blinding as political strategy, Byzantine emperors weaponized these ancient taboos, turning physiology into fate. Yet the blinded weren't always passive victims. Historians record cases like Emperor Romanos IV, who continued to rule for years after his blinding, relying on advisors to describe documents and battle formations. His resilience highlights the paradox of this punishment. While it stripped away independence, it couldn't extinguish the human spirit. The same adaptability that made eyesight a metaphor for power also ensured its loss wasn't always the end. As we explore how other cultures weaponized the senses, remember this: whether through darkness, silence, or isolation, the most enduring punishments weren't those that merely harmed the body, but those that reshaped perception itself. Because to control how someone experiences the world is to control the world they believe in. The Iron Maiden stands as one of history's most debated instruments of terror, a nightmarish fusion of artistry and agony. Descriptions paint a grim picture: a human-sized cabinet lined with inward-facing spikes, its hinged door designed to close with torturous slowness. As the victim was sealed inside, the spikes would pierce flesh at calculated intervals, avoiding vital organs to prolong suffering. Whether this device was a genuine medieval torture tool or a macabre fabrication from later centuries remains contested, but its legacy in popular culture is undeniable. The Iron Maiden became shorthand for the darkest corners of justice, a symbol of how fear could be sculpted into cold, gleaming metal. What makes the Iron Maiden so compelling isn't just its brutality, but its theatricality. Unlike crude implements like axes or racks, this device was engineered for psychological impact. The spikes weren't randomly placed, they targeted limbs and torso in a way that maximized pain without immediate fatality. Some accounts describe victims being forced to stand perfectly still to avoid deeper impalement, turning their own bodies into instruments of self-torture. And then there's the sound, the slow creak of the door closing, the gasp as the first spike broke skin, the metallic tang of blood pooling at the base. This wasn't just punishment, it was a grotesque performance where every detail amplified terror. Historians remain divided on the Iron Maiden's authenticity. No physical evidence from the medieval period survives, and the most famous examples, like the Nuremberg Maiden, were likely assembled centuries later, possibly as macabre curiosities. Yet even as myth, its persistence reveals something profound. The Iron Maiden embodies the medieval obsession with symbolic justice, where punishment mirrored the crime in poetic, often exaggerated ways. A blasphemer might be crushed beneath stone tablets, a thief's hand severed. The Iron Maiden, whether real or imagined, fit this pattern perfectly. A coffin for the living, where the condemned confronted their mortality spike by spike. The device's cultural afterlife is just as fascinating. Romantic-era writers and Gothic novelists latched onto the Iron Maiden as a symbol of medieval barbarism, contrasting it with their own enlightened age. In doing so, they overlooked the equally brutal punishments of their time: public hangings, brandings, and transportation to penal colonies. The Iron Maiden became a convenient scapegoat, a way to distance modern justice from its own violence. Today, it appears in heavy metal logos and horror films, a stock villain in humanity's gallery of cruelty. Yet the Iron Maiden's greatest lesson isn't about spikes or hinges, it's about collective fear. Because while this device may belong to the realm of legend, the next chapter of punishment history is undeniably real. Entire communities targeted for the crimes of a few. From the ashes of individual suffering, we turn to the even darker calculus of mass punishment. Collective punishment was the ancient world's most ruthless form of social control, a system where innocence offered no protection. When one person defied authority, entire families, villages, or even generations could face the consequences. In ancient China, the 9 familial exterminations policy meant that for crimes like treason, everyone connected to the offender, parents, siblings, children, even distant cousins, would be executed. The Tang Code spelled it out plainly: when one is guilty, all share the fate. But this wasn't just about bloodshed, it was about weaving fear into the fabric of community itself. A single act of defiance could unravel an entire family tree, turning kinship into a liability. The logic behind these draconian measures was chillingly effective. By making rebellion a death sentence for loved ones, rulers ensured dissent carried unbearable emotional weight. A would-be traitor couldn't just weigh personal risk. They had to consider their toddler's laughter, their elderly mother's frail hands, their sibling's unborn child. In Assyria, entire villages were flayed alive or impaled en masse when one resident harbored a fugitive. The message was clear: loyalty wasn't just individual, it was collective. Your neighbor's choices could doom you, so everyone became an enforcer, watching each other with nervous suspicion. Archaeological evidence reveals how deeply this fear permeated daily life. Cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia detail families pleading with local officials to disown rebellious relatives preemptively. Han Dynasty letters show parents reporting their own children's seditious remarks to avoid extermination. Even burial sites tell stories of mass graves where infants lie beside grandparents, their bones bearing identical execution marks. These weren't just punishments, they were social experiments, reshaping human relationships into instruments of control. Yet collective punishment's darkest legacy lies in its psychological aftermath. Survivors bore a unique torment, the guilt of living when others died for another's actions. Babylonian texts describe the curse of the spared, where those exempted from mass executions were shunned as reminders of loss. In medieval Europe, villagers forced to hang one of their own developed rituals to cope, sharing the rope's cost, burying the condemned in unconsecrated ground together. These acts reveal a grim truth. When justice targets the innocent, it doesn't just punish, it corrodes the bonds that hold society together. Now we turn to a punishment that weaponized the body's own fragility. Because while collective punishment shattered communities, the next method turned the human form into its own prison where bones became shackles and breath became the executioner. The Judas cradle turned gravity itself into an instrument of torment, an ingenious perversion of simple physics. Picture a narrow wooden pyramid, its sharp apex pointing upward like a grotesque seat. Victims, often stripped naked for maximum humiliation, would be lowered onto this point, their own body weight driving the tapered edge deeper with every slightest movement. Unlike more visibly brutal methods like flaying or impalement, the cradle's genius lay in its subtlety. It left no gaping wounds or spilled blood, just excruciating internal damage and psychological scars that outlasted the physical pain. What made this device particularly sinister was its association with the Spanish Inquisition, where extracting confessions was both goal and performance. Prisoners might be hoisted over the cradle for hours, teased with the threat of dissent before finally being allowed to drop, only to be raised again as the pain peaked. Some accounts describe inquisitors rocking the victim gently, intensifying the agony with each sway. The absence of visible marks allowed authorities to claim they hadn't technically drawn blood, a loophole in ecclesiastical law that turned torture into a semantic game. The Judas Cradle's name carries its own dark irony. Some historians suggest it references betrayal, forcing the victim to sit in judgment of themselves as their body betrayed their resolve. Others note its resemblance to a birthing stool, perverting symbols of life into tools of suffering. This duality reveals a deeper truth about ancient punishments. The most effective ones didn't just hurt, they corrupted meaning itself, turning everyday objects into vectors of terror. Yet the cradle was just one example of how executioners weaponized basic physics. From stretching victims on racks to crushing them under incrementally added stones, these methods showcased a chilling understanding of human physiology. As we move from human-engineered torment to punishments involving animals, remember this: when justice becomes spectacle, even nature itself can be conscripted into the theater of cruelty. Damnatio ad Bestias wasn't just execution, it was Rome's most savage form of theater, where the roar of the crowd merged with the snarls of starving beasts. Imagine the scene: a convicted criminal, often a slave or prisoner of war, pushed into the sun-baked arena as thousands cheered from the stands. The animals, lions from Africa, bears from the northern forests, even exotic leopards, had been deliberately starved for days to heighten their aggression. As the gates creaked open, the condemned didn't just face death, they became the centerpiece of a grotesque performance, their suffering choreographed to entertain the masses. The genius of Damnatio ad Bestias lay in its symbolism. By pitting humans against beasts, Rome reinforced the social hierarchy. Civilized citizens safe in the stands, barbarians and criminals reduced to prey in the sand. Some victims were dressed as mythological figures, re-energizing scenes where heroes battled monsters, except here, the outcome was never in doubt. Emperors like Caligula and Nero elevated these spectacles into political tools, using them to humiliate enemies or celebrate military victories. After crushing a rebellion in Judea, Titus flooded the Colosseum with captured Jews and lions, turning genocide into public sport. But the horror went deeper than bloodshed. The animals weren't just executioners, they were props in a psychological drama. Starvation made their attacks erratic, prolonging the victim's terror. Some accounts describe beasts initially ignoring the condemned, forcing handlers to prod them with hot irons. Others tell of animals that refused to kill, as if revolted by the spectacle, only to be slaughtered themselves for disobedience. Even in death, the victim's body was denied dignity, often left to rot in the arena as a final insult. What's often overlooked is how Damnatio ad Bestias mirrored Rome's own contradictions. The same society that built aqueducts and codified law also reveled in watching living beings torn limb from limb. Philosophers like Seneca wrote of being sickened by the carnage, yet the games persisted for centuries, a testament to humanity's capacity to normalize brutality. The practice only faded as Christianity gained influence, not because of newfound empathy, but because martyrdom in the arena gave victims a power even emperors couldn't control. From the roar of the Colosseum, we turn to punishments that refused to end at death, where the condemned were persecuted beyond the grave, their memory and remains subjected to rituals designed to erase them from history itself. Death wasn't always the end of punishment. Some civilizations made sure suffering outlasted the final breath. In ancient Greece, denying burial was a fate worse than execution itself. Criminals, traitors, or those who offended the gods would be left to rot under the open sky, their souls condemned to wander the earth for eternity. This wasn't just about neglecting a corpse, it was a spiritual death sentence, severing the deceased from the underworld rituals that granted peace. Even Homer's Iliad captures this horror, Achilles dragging Hector's body behind his chariot, defiling it day after day. knowing the true torment wasn't the physical desecration but the denial of funeral rites that would anchor Hector's spirit. The Romans took post-mortem punishment to grotesque extremes with pona cullae, the penalty of the sack. Parricides, those who killed their parents, were sewn into leather sacks with live animals, a rooster, a dog, a viper, and a monkey, then thrown into water. The symbolism was deliberate. The sack represented the womb, the animals embodied chaos, and the drowning mirrored a perverse rebirth into eternal suffering. Even the order of the animals held meaning, with the viper's venom ensuring agony if the water didn't claim the condemned first. These rituals weren't just about the body, they were about annihilating identity, ensuring the criminal's name would be cursed for generations. In medieval Europe, the stakes were literal. Bodies of executed criminals were displayed on gibbets, iron cages where bones slowly weathered into dust. Highwaymen like Dick Turpin dangled at crossroads, their skeletal remains acting as macabre road signs. The message was clear: crime wouldn't just kill you, it would erase your humanity, leaving your corpse as a public spectacle. Some cultures went further, dismembering bodies and burying pieces in separate locations to prevent resurrection or spiritual wholeness. A severed head might be mounted on a city gate, while limbs were buried in unconsecrated ground, scattering the soul like shattered pottery. These practices reveal a universal fear that justice wasn't confined to the living. By desecrating the dead, societies weaponized the afterlife, turning mortality into an extension of their authority. But if denying rest was the ultimate spiritual punishment, the next method proved that life itself could be stretched into endless torment. Because in the mines and galleys of the ancient world, forced labor wasn't just work, it was a death sentence written in slow, grinding motion. The mines of the ancient world weren't just workplaces, they were slaughterhouses disguised as industry. When Rome sentenced criminals to the sulfur pits of Sicily or the silver mines of Spain, they weren't just handing down labor, they were signing death warrants written in dust and darkness. Picture a labyrinth of tunnels barely tall enough to crouch in, where the air hung thick with toxic fumes. Workers chained at the ankles swung pickaxes in near-total blackness, their lungs filling with mineral particles that turned breath into agony. Death didn't come quickly here. It crept in over months through malnutrition, cave-ins, or the slow poison of mercury vapors in gold mines, but speed wasn't the point. The mines were designed to squeeze every ounce of utility from a life before discarding it like spent ore. What made this punishment uniquely insidious was its dual purpose. On one hand, it served as a deterrent. A few crimes seemed worth the certainty of suffocating under miles of rock. On the other, it fed the empire's insatiable appetite for resources. The mines of Carthago Nova in Spain alone produced enough silver to mint millions of denarii, the coins that fueled Rome's expansion. This wasn't just justice, it was state-sponsored slavery, where the condemned became human machinery, their suffering literally minted into currency. Even the philosopher Seneca, no stranger to Rome's cruelty, wrote of miners living in the earth like moles, their existence so bleak that sunlight became a distant memory. The psychological torment rivaled the physical. Unlike dramatic executions in the arena, mine labor erased identity slowly. There were no crowds to witness your suffering, no songs to memorialize your fate, just the endless rhythm of hammer on stone, the clink of chains, the coughs of dying men echoing through tunnels. Some mine shafts have been found with crude tallies scratched into walls, marking days like prisoners counting down a sentence. Others reveal skeletons still clutching makeshift amulets, as if magic could ward off the inevitable. These artifacts whisper a chilling truth. The mines didn't just break bodies, they dismantled hope itself. Yet the true horror lay in the hypocrisy. Rome prided itself on legal codes and civic virtue, yet its wealth was built on this hidden genocide. When Pliny the Elder praised Spain's mines as the arteries of the empire, he glossed over the human cost the thousands who entered those tunnels never to emerge. Even in death, miners were denied dignity. Mass graves near ancient mining sites show bodies piled like refuse, their bones stained green from copper exposure or twisted from years of unnatural postures. This was punishment stripped of all pretenses, where justice meant becoming a nameless cog in an economic machine. From these subterranean tombs, we turn to punishments that traded grim utility for theatrical precision, where execution became less about profit and more about symbolism so potent it could shape cultures for centuries. Because while the mines erased lives quietly, some methods ensured no one would ever look away. The blood eagle stands as one of history's most debated and grisly punishments, a ritual so extreme it straddles the line between legend and forensic possibility. According to Norse sagas, victims often rivaled chieftains or oath-breakers were restrained face down while their backs were sliced open along the spine. Ribs were severed from the vertebrae and splayed outward like the beams of a ship. Then the lungs were carefully extracted and draped over the shoulders, their rhythmic inflation creating the illusion of wings in the wind. The final act, a handful of salt tossed onto the exposed organs, ensuring consciousness lasted until the very last shuddering breath. What makes the blood eagle so chilling isn't just the physical brutality, but its symbolic precision. In Viking culture, eagles were sacred to Odin, the god of war and wisdom. By transforming a man into a blood eagle, executioners weren't just killing, they were offering a living sacrifice to the divine. The ritual's theatricality also served a political purpose. Sagas describe crowds gathering to witness the spectacle, their horror cementing the perpetrator's reputation as a force of unshakable power. This wasn't mere execution, it was performance art woven with spiritual significance, where pain and mythology collided. Historians still clash over whether the blood eagle was historical practice or literary exaggeration. Skeptics point to the lack of archaeological evidence and the saga author's penchant for dramatic flair. Yet forensic experiments suggest the act was anatomically plausible, if excruciatingly slow. What's undeniable is how the blood eagle captures the Viking worldview, a universe where honor demanded visceral retribution and justice was as much about symbolism as suffering. The ritual's endurance in pop culture, from heavy metal lyrics to TV dramas, proves its power to unsettle, even a millennium later. But perhaps the blood eagle's true legacy lies in its psychological impact. Unlike anonymous executions, this was punishment designed to be seen, remembered, and retold. It transformed victims into myths, their agony immortalized in poetry and song. As we shift from physical to psychological torment, consider this. If the blood eagle was meant to haunt the living, what horrors awaited those condemned to punishments that targeted the mind itself? Because some methods didn't just break bones, they shattered reality. The rack was a masterpiece of slow-motion destruction, a wooden frame where the body itself became the instrument of its own undoing. Strapped at the wrists and ankles to rotating rollers, victims would hear the creak of the mechanism before feeling the first terrible tug as their limbs were pulled in opposite directions. Joints popped one by one, shoulders, elbows, knees, each dislocation a crescendo in a symphony of agony designed not to kill but to break. Unlike swift executions, the rack's horror lay in its precision. Torturers could measure their efforts like bakers kneading dough, stopping just short of fatal damage to prolong the ordeal for hours or even days. Confession was the rack's true purpose, not truth. Medieval inquisitors operated on a chilling logic. Pain purified the soul, and a screamed admission, whether factual or fabricated, held more weight than mere evidence. Records from the Spanish Inquisition describe prisoners signing fantastical confessions of witchcraft or heresy simply to end the torment, their inked signatures trembling beneath dislocated fingers. Some jurisdictions even mandated that executions follow confessions extracted this way, creating a perverse incentive for torturers to persist until the doomed prisoner confirmed their guilt. The rack didn't just stretch bodies, it stretched morality, warping justice into a performance where suffering equaled proof. The device's psychological impact was as calculated as its physical effects. Strapped immobile, victims faced not just pain but the terror of anticipation, the knowledge that each turn of the wheel was irreversible. A dislocated shoulder might heal, but the memory of tendons snapping like overtuned violin strings lingered. Even the terminology was weaponized. French torturers called it le chevalet, the little horse, evoking the image of riding into agony. English interrogators spoke of persuading prisoners, as if the rack's embrace was merely a forceful debate tactic. Yet the rack's legacy extends beyond dungeons and inquisitions. Modern legal systems still grapple with its shadow, the tension between coercion and truth, between expedience and ethics. When we hear phrases like enhanced interrogation or see defendants recounting confessions made under duress, we're witnessing echoes of that wooden frame and its relentless rollers. The rack didn't vanish with the Middle Ages. It simply evolved, reminding us that the line between justice and brutality is often as thin as a prisoner's scream. Now consider a punishment that traded physical torment for social annihilation, because while the rack targeted the body, others struck at something even more fundamental, a person's place in the world, unraveling their identity thread by thread. The stocks turned punishment into a public spectacle where shame cut deeper than any blade. Picture a wooden frame clamped around the offender's ankles and wrists, forcing them into an awkward crouch in the town square for hours or even days. Unlike the privacy of a dungeon, this was justice on full display, where every passing neighbor could contribute to the penalty. Rotten food, mud, or worse would rain down on the trapped offender, their humiliation amplified by the jeers of children and the scorn of those they once called friends. But the true genius of the stocks wasn't the physical discomfort, it was the way it transformed punishment into a communal act, making every citizen an enforcer of social order. This method flourished in medieval Europe and colonial America for minor offenses, drunkenness, petty theft, or public disorder. The message was clear: crime didn't just anger the authorities, it fractured the trust of the entire community. Records from 17th century England describe bakers locked in stocks for selling undersized loaves, their failures literally weighed and displayed. In Puritan settlements, gossips might find themselves pinned beside livestock markets, their tongues silenced by the very crowds they once whispered to. The stocks didn't just punish individuals, they reinforced collective values, turning morality into theater where everyone played a role. Yet the psychological impact far outweighed the physical. Unlike fleeting lashings or fines, the stocks left scars on reputation, not skin. A few hours of exposure could brand someone for life, their shame etched into local memory long after the wood had been put away. Some towns even added ironic flourishes. A drunkard's stocks might be placed outside a tavern, a thief's near the marketplace they robbed. The punishment mirrored the crime with poetic precision, ensuring the lesson stuck. What's often overlooked is how the stocks reveal society's evolving relationship with justice. As Enlightenment ideas spread, these public spectacles fell out of favor, deemed too barbaric for an era that prized dignity and privacy. But the core principle, using social pressure to enforce norms, never truly vanished. Today, viral public shaming on social media carries eerie echoes of those wooden frames, proving that while the tools change, the human instinct to police through humiliation remains. From the communal cruelty of the stocks, we turn to punishments that removed society entirely, where nature itself became the executioner, and isolation was the ultimate sentence. Because while shame required an audience, some sentences were designed to erase all witnesses, leaving the condemned alone with the elements, their fate whispered only by the wind. Exposure was the ultimate act of judicial outsourcing, a punishment where civilization stepped aside and let nature do its worst. From the wind-scorched deserts of Persia to the frozen tundras of Siberia, societies devised ways to abandon criminals beyond the boundaries of human mercy. The method was deceptively simple. A convicted murderer or traitor might be left on a barren rock in the Aegean Sea, their ankles chained just enough to prevent swimming but not enough to drown quickly. In the Andes, offenders were deposited on glacial peaks, where thin air and sub-zero temperatures worked faster than any executioner's axe. These weren't just deaths, they were surrenders to the elements, a way for societies to wash their hands of bloodshed while still guaranteeing a grim outcome. What made exposure uniquely terrifying was its illusion of chance. Unlike beheading or burning, where death was deliberate and immediate, abandonment introduced a sliver of uncertainty, one that only deepened the psychological torment. A sailor cast adrift might hallucinate rescue as dehydration set in. A thief left in the desert could wander for days, mirages taunting them with false hope. Ancient legal codes often framed these sentences as letting the gods decide, but the reality was never in doubt. Whether by thirst, hypothermia, or predation, nature always collected its due. The Mongols perfected this art, tying prisoners to trees in wolf-infested forests, their fate sealed not by human hands, but by the natural order they'd supposedly violated. The symbolism ran deep. Exposure didn't just kill, it erased. Without graves or markers, the condemned vanished from history, their bodies swallowed by sand or sea. Greek myths echoed this fear. Characters like Prometheus, chained to a rock for eagles to feast upon, served as divine parallels to earthly punishments. Even the language reflected this. The Roman interdictio aquae et ignes, denial of fire and water, wasn't just a sentence of exile. It was a revocation of humanity's two most basic protections against nature's indifference. Yet exposure's cruelty had tactical benefits. Rulers could claim moral distance, framing deaths as acts of providence rather than state-sanctioned murder. When the Scythians left traitors naked on the steppes, their bones later gnawed by wild horses, it wasn't the tribe delivering justice, it was the spirits of the land. This fiction of neutrality allowed societies to maintain ideals of mercy while practicing ruthlessness. Modern archaeology reveals traces of these rituals: rusted chains on remote islands, frozen mummies in mountain passes, even sun-bleached skeletons arranged as if still crawling toward salvation. As we move from punishments that weaponized the environment to those targeting human expression, consider this. If exposure sought to silence people by removing them from society entirely, the next methods aimed to stifle the voice itself, not through isolation, but through deliberate, irreversible mutilation. Because in some cultures, the greatest crime wasn't just acting against authority, but daring to speak against it. Tongue removal was more than mutilation. It was the surgical silencing of rebellion, a deliberate strike against the very currency of dissent. Across civilizations from ancient Rome to imperial China, authorities understood that controlling speech meant controlling reality itself. A blasphemer in medieval Europe might find their tongue clipped with red-hot shears, while a rebellious scribe in Assyria could lose theirs to a ceremonial dagger. The message was unambiguous, words were weapons, and those who wielded them against power would be disarmed permanently. The brutality of this punishment lay in its precision. Unlike the indiscriminate violence of flogging or the theatrical horror of crucifixion, tongue removal targeted a specific human faculty, the ability to articulate thought. Persian records describe court physicians supervising the procedure, ensuring just enough of the tongue remained for swallowing but not enough for coherent speech. In Byzantium, convicted slanderers received a grotesque parody of their crime, their severed tongues nailed to the courthouse door like macabre receipts. This wasn't random cruelty, it was symbolic justice where the punishment physically manifested the transgression. But the true genius of tongue removal was its psychological aftershock. Victims survived as walking warnings, their garbled attempts at speech a constant reminder of authorities' reach. Chinese dynasties perfected this tactic with the punishment of the living memorial, where scholars who criticized the emperor would be paraded through towns, forced to gesture mutely at their stitched mouths. The terror wasn't just in the act itself, it was in the transformation of articulate thinkers into broken puppets, their unspoken ideas dying with every glance from frightened onlookers. Archaeological evidence reveals how deeply this practice scarred societies. Excavated skulls from Viking settlements show healed tongue bone fractures, suggesting some victims endured the ordeal long before eventual death. Legal scrolls from Mughal India detail tongue weight specific measurements of how much to remove based on the severity of the offense. Even language itself bears traces. The English word mute shares roots with the Latin mutus, meaning not just silent but forcibly silenced. What makes this punishment resonate today is its eerie modernity. In an age where information spreads at the speed of light, the impulse to control speech remains, whether through censorship, intimidation, or more subtle forms of suppression. The next chapter of punitive history reveals how societies escalated from silencing individuals to crafting entire human monuments of warning, where bodies weren't just broken but transformed into enduring symbols of terror. Gibbeting transformed execution into an enduring spectacle, a slow unraveling of flesh and bone designed to sear its lesson into public memory. Picture an iron cage swaying in the wind, its skeletal occupant gradually picked clean by birds and weather, their hollow eye sockets staring blankly at passers-by for months or even years. Unlike quick executions, gibbeting weaponized time itself, stretching punishment far beyond death. Highwaymen like Britain's William Spigot dangled along well-traveled roads, their creaking cages serving as grim mile markers. In colonial America, pirate Charles Gibbs' gibbet hung in New York Harbor for decades, rusting into the skyline as a maritime warning. This wasn't just about retribution, it was psychological warfare where decay became a civic curriculum. The process was meticulously staged. After hanging, bodies would be coated in tar to slow decomposition, ensuring maximum visibility. Some cages featured hinged doors, allowing authorities to periodically rearrange bones for dramatic effect. In London's execution dock, tides would wash against gibbeted pirates, giving the illusion they drowned daily, a macabre nod to their crimes at sea. The symbolism ran deep. Just as the body eroded, so too would the criminal's legacy, their name erased while their remains lingered as anonymous cautionary tales. Gibbeting's power lay in its accessibility. Unlike dungeon tortures hidden from view, these displays democratized punishment. Farmers hauling goods to market, children playing in fields, all became unwilling students in this open-air classroom of horror. Records from 18th century England describe families picnicking beneath gibbets, their casual acceptance underscoring how these spectacles blurred the line between justice and macabre entertainment. The practice persisted into the 19th century, with some cages reportedly repurposed as makeshift birdhouses after their occupants finally crumbled, nature reclaiming the tools of terror. Yet gibbeting's true innovation was its efficiency. A single corpse could deter countless crimes without further bloodshed, its silent sermon requiring no executioner's salary. As we turn from these skeletal sentinels to our final punishment, consider how theater and terror merged in rituals where death wasn't the end, but the opening act of an even darker performance, one where the condemned played their part long after their final breath. The wagon wheel punishment turned execution into a traveling nightmare, a slow parade of agony where the journey itself became the sentence. Unlike stationary tortures, this method ensured the entire community bore witness, transforming streets into stages and citizens into unwilling participants. Victims would be lashed to the heavy wooden spokes of a cartwheel, their limbs contorted between the beams as the wheel lurched over cobblestones and dirt roads. Every jolt and bump sent waves of pain through shattered bones or dislocated joints, while the rolling motion prolonged suffering that might otherwise have ended quickly on a static rack. What made this punishment uniquely sinister was its theatrical versatility. In some German towns, the wheel would pause at significant locations: the market square where the crime occurred, the victim's home, even the local church, allowing spectators to jeer or plead for mercy. The procession wasn't just about punishment. It was a narrative, with each stop adding another chapter to the condemned's public unraveling. Records from 17th century Strasbourg describe how authorities timed these spectacles to coincide with market days, ensuring maximum attendance. By the time the wheel reached the execution site, the prisoner wasn't just broken physically, they'd been dismantled socially, their identity reduced to a cautionary tale playing out in real time. The wheel's symbolic weight carried spiritual undertones. Its circular shape mirrored the cyclical nature of justice, while the relentless forward motion echoed the inevitability of divine retribution. Some accounts suggest victims were rotated to face different directions during the procession: east toward the rising sun as a nod to resurrection, then west toward the setting sun as a reminder of mortality. This wasn't random cruelty, it was ritualized storytelling where every turn of the wheel reinforced moral and cosmic order. Yet the practice also exposed society's conflicted relationship with punishment. Diaries from the period reveal spectators who brought gifts of alcohol or food to ease the condemned's suffering, even as they participated in the spectacle. Children reportedly darted alongside the wheels, their horror blending with morbid fascination. The line between justice and entertainment blurred until the two became indistinguishable, a dynamic that persists today in our appetite for true crime dramas and publicized trials. As we approach our final punishment, consider how far these methods went beyond the body, because the darkest torments weren't those that broke bones or spilled blood, but those designed to fracture the soul itself, leaving wounds no healer could mend. The concept of damnation turned justice eternal, where earthly punishments were mere preludes to an unending symphony of suffering. Ancient Egyptians believed the heart of a criminal would be devoured by Ammit, the crocodile-headed demon of the afterlife, erasing their soul from existence. In Norse mythology, oath-breakers faced Nastrand, a corpse-strewn shore where venom dripped from the ceiling like rain, their skin flayed anew each dawn. These weren't just stories, they were psychological levers, ensuring compliance long after authorities stopped watching. A thief might evade the magistrate's whip, but who could escape a god's wrath? Religious damnation didn't just punish, it redefined crime itself. In medieval Europe, heresy trials often focused less on actions than on beliefs, sentencing souls rather than bodies. The Inquisition's auto da fe ceremonies publicly burned unrepentant sinners, but the true terror lay in what came next, eternal flames that no human hand could extinguish. Legal codes wove theology into their fabric. Byzantine law equated treason with blasphemy, while Hindu Dharmashastras warned that minor thefts could trap souls in cycles of rebirth as vermin. Justice became a collaborative effort between kings and clerics, with gallows and hellfire working in tandem. Archaeology reveals how deeply these beliefs permeated daily life. Amulets buried with Roman convicts suggest attempts to bribe underworld judges, while Celtic bog bodies clutched charred oats, offerings for deities they hoped might commute their sentences. Even architecture reflected this duality. Courthouses built beside churches, their spires and gavels pointing toward the same ominous sky. What makes damnation unique among punishments is its invisibility. Unlike a gibbet or branding iron, its tools were faith and imagination, forces far harder to resist. Modern legal systems may have secularized, but echoes remain. The fear of a permanent record, the stigma of life-ruining convictions, these are damnation's secular heirs. As we close this grim catalogue, remember, the darkest punishments weren't those that broke bones, but those that shackled minds across centuries. The true measure of justice isn't just what we inflict, but what we dare to believe. Reflecting on these 25 punishments reveals a staggering journey from the brazen bull's agonizing theater to the cold efficiency of modern courtrooms. Ancient justice was a performance where pain served as both penalty and propaganda, etching its lessons into flesh and bone. Today, the gavel's fall replaces the executioner's axe, and prison bars stand where iron maidens once loomed. But this evolution isn't just about swapping brutality for civility. It's a fundamental shift in what societies value. Where rulers once demanded fear, we now ask for fairness. Where guilt was wrung from trembling lips by the rack, it's now debated by juries under fluorescent lights. Yet traces of the past linger in unexpected ways. Public trials, once spectacles of suffering, endure as pillars of transparency, though now they're streamed online rather than staged in town squares. The concept of deterrence remains, but instead of bodies on stakes, we have sentencing guidelines and parole hearings. Even rehabilitation has roots in ancient practices. Medieval monasteries sometimes offered sanctuary to criminals willing to repent, a far cry from today's educational programs in prisons, yet sharing the same hopeful core that people can change. The most profound difference lies in who bears the weight of justice. Ancient systems crushed individuals to uphold order, while modern ideals strive to balance accountability with dignity. Forensic science replaces forced confessions. Mental health evaluations stand where thumbscrews once twisted. But this progress isn't inevitable. It's the result of centuries of protest, philosophy, and hard-won legal reforms. Figures like Cesare Beccaria, whose 18th-century writings condemned torture, or Dorothea Dix, who exposed prison abuses, chipped away at the assumption that cruelty equaled justice. Still, the shadows of history challenge us. Mass incarceration, solitary confinement, even the death penalty. These modern practices sometimes feel like distant echoes of older horrors. Understanding where we've been isn't just academic, it's a compass for where we're going, because the true measure of justice isn't in its severity, but in its ability to heal, to correct, and above all, to recognize the humanity in every person, even those who have strayed beyond society's lines. The journey from brutality to rights is far from over, but each step forward honors those who suffered under the wheel, the gibbet, and the blade, ensuring their pain wasn't in vain. As we close this journey through the brutal theaters of ancient justice, It's worth stepping back to ask, what were these punishments truly solving? Beneath the spectacle of flayed skin and broken bones lay a desperate human impulse, the need to impose order in a world without forensics, prisons, or even widespread literacy. A Babylonian king couldn't run background checks or track stolen goods with digital records. A medieval lord had no surveillance cameras to deter thieves. So they turned pain into punctuation, crafting punishments so vivid they'd echo through generations. The brazen bull wasn't just a tool of agony. It was a crude but effective crime deterrent in a society where written laws were still etched in clay. Yet these methods reveal a paradox. The same civilizations that built soaring temples and penned epic poetry also engineered horrors like the breaking wheel or Scaphism. How do we reconcile such creativity with such cruelty? Perhaps because ancient justice wasn't just about the criminal, it was about the audience. When Rome crucified rebels along the Appian Way, or when Assyrians draped flayed skins over city gates, they weren't just punishing individuals. They were scripting a visceral warning for every citizen who passed by, turning fear into the glue that held fragile societies together. This duality lingers today. Our modern courts may have traded spikes for subpoenas, but the core challenges remain. How do we balance mercy and deterrence? When does justice become vengeance? The blood-stained pages of history offer no easy answers, but they do remind us how far we've come and how easily progress can unravel. So as you reflect on these 25 punishments, consider not just their shock value, but what they reveal about us. The human mind hasn't changed, only our tools have. Those iron maidens and gibbet cages were products of their time, just as our courtrooms and prisons are products of ours. The real question isn't, how could they do such things, but what will future generations say about our own systems? Before you go, I'd love to hear which punishment stuck with you the most. Was it the calculated horror of the blood eagle, the psychological warfare of the brazen bull? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into history's shadows, hit subscribe. There are plenty more untold stories waiting in the past, and together we'll keep bringing them into the light. Until next time, stay curious, but maybe sleep with the lights on tonight.